and it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce Dr Cherryl Hunt of Exeter University. She was originally a molecular biologist and then switched to theology, doing a master's degree, and has worked on a project using the Bible in environmental ethics. That resulted in a couple of books, edited collections and so on, and she is currently engaged on a research project funded by the Bible Society to evaluate the progress and outcomes of their Pathfinder program, which is designed to promote a deeper understanding and appreciation of the Bible, resulting in growth in faith and a new level of cultural engagement. She has other interests, particularly Christian reflection on bioethics, including the status of the early human embryo, stem cell research, and human enhancement. And so today she is going to speak to us about ethical challenges in contemporary science.
Thank you. Yes, this whole day is devoted to looking at some ethical challenges generated by contemporary science. And in this first session, I'm going to be introducing the subject really, looking at... So is it not Am I loud enough at the back? Yeah.
Cheryl's unable to wear a light.
Oh, sorry.
She can't wear one.
We're looking at ethics, theology, and the biosciences, sort of introducing the general subject. Obviously, the whole area, this whole area of bioethics is one of great discussion and has been for the last few decades. Perhaps the middle of the 20th century was the time when physics was throwing up the ethical dilemmas, what to do with the power of the atom. Since then, biology has been generating a lot more ethical debate, not least in the advances, scientific and technological, concerning the beginnings and the ends of life. We have the technology to prolong human life beyond that which was previously possible. But more importantly, perhaps, we now have the technology to manipulate the very early stages of human existence with fertilization outside the body. And the development of those techniques has not only raised questions about how we treat the very early stages of Homo sapiens. Do we treat these very early balls of cells in the same way as we treat our next door neighbour? What sorts of rights do we ascribe to them? But it has also raised a host of other issues because the very ability to manipulate those early stages has, in conjunction with the advances in genetic technology, enabled us to do a lot more with them at that stage. So we now have the ability to take genes from one species and insert into another. We have the ability to take some cells from another species and insert them into the early embryo of another. Or we have the ability to actually hybridize different species. And so this mixing of animal and human has become possible over the last few years, and certainly in this country generated a huge amount of debate in the press over the last year or two when we had new legislation coming through which was aimed at permitting the experimentation with early human embryos and this sort of controlling the amount of mixing that was allowed between animal and human tissues and how long you could let those early embryos survive in the laboratory. So there's been a huge amount of public interest in this whole topic. Of course, the other advances in genetics have allowed, and in technology, have allowed potential discussion of improving humans, not just mending them when things go wrong, but actually enhancing them. And that, again, is a topic of much debate currently as to what should be the limits, if any, of this process. GM crops have, again, been in the press more recently. They were, certainly in this country, a contentious issue a few years ago and sort of set to become one again, I think. A public debate concern largely over safety, I think, in the public sphere, but certainly also in the ethical sphere, how much it is right to be changing the genetic identity of species that have evolved through natural selection in the ecosystems in which we find them. And of course this all raises that very popular phrase, playing God. Are humans in these situations playing God? And if they are, should they be? Are humans taking to themselves some abilities which are actually beyond what they should be taking? And this has been raised very, very recently with the publication of the results of Craig Venter's lab's work on so-called synthetic life. And I'm not going to talk about that because I think John's probably going to touch on that in his talk later on. He's mentioned the genes talk later on. Overshadowing all of these discussions for the last few years has been the debate on human responsibility towards the rest of the world. The environmental crisis, whether you do or do not subscribe to the view that human-generated climate change is going to be a threat over the next few years, nobody can deny that the pressures of human population growth are putting a large number of ecosystems around the globe under stress, and that we do have a huge rate of extinction now amongst the other species with which we share the planet. So that again has raised a whole host of ethical issues, and these are being debated in the public square but also within faith communities, because communities of religious faith where there is some belief in a higher being inevitably then have to consider their own responsibilities, not just to other human beings but to the wider set of species with whom we share the globe. All of these debates are taking place against a backdrop of a culture which has been inevitably hugely influenced by science and technology. If you try to prise a teenager away from their iPlayer or their mobile phone, you will discover to which extent humanity is now dependent on the technological aids with which we surround ourselves. But this influences, no doubt, our approaches to some of these ethical issues. At the same time, though, everybody is aware of how much they depend on technology, and yet at the same time, there is, within the public square, certainly, a certain amount of mistrust of science, it seems to me, still. In Britain, certainly, some of this stems from particular kind of things which have been published in the newspapers. Still, there's some mistrust arising from the handling of the BSE, the mad cow debate a few years ago, and people saying it was safe and then it wasn't. And so people now are kind of a little mistrustful of scientific prognostications. More recently, there's been the, what I've seen called Climategate, the concern about scientists manipulating data and intercepted emails. So there's this, again, within the public square, there's this kind of mistrust. They don't trust scientists perhaps as much as they used to. When we're thinking then of ethical debate, not only are we thinking of the science, but we're also thinking of the backdrop of wider society, where there is what tends to be a postmodern mistrust of absolutes. There's a much wider tendency nowadays in public debate to say, well, you have this code of behaviour, you think this is right, that's fine for you, but I'm going to live the way I think. There are, and many people would argue, no rights, no absolute rights and wrongs. You live by the code that you see is right, and that's all you're responsible for. So there's this kind of pluralism of ethical viewpoints in society. And the other factor I don't think we can ignore is the backdrop to all of this is a world of still huge global inequality. Although we see a huge amount of development going on in some countries which have previously not been able to grow and develop their technology, and we see huge growth in China and India, there is nevertheless a huge disparity in wealth and resources across the globe. And that we cannot ignore that when we start thinking about ethical issues and the uses to which science is put. So what I'm going to do today is there's actually more you'll find on the handouts than there is on the slides, because I was a little over-ambitious with what I thought I was going to get through today. I'm just going to outline some of the terminology. Some of you will be very familiar with this, so please bear with me, but others of you may not have come across some of the terms which get used in ethical debate, and so I'm just going to outline some of those just to kind of help get through that jargon barrier. And then think about how, in a bit more detail, think about how, from a Christian viewpoint, we might do some bioethical reflection. How do we start? Now, although I'll be coming from a Christian viewpoint and using a case study based on Christian scriptures, that's what Christians refer to as the Old and New Testament, there's obviously a great deal of overlap, largely between the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh, and I'm hoping that some of the principles that we'll be exploring in thinking about ancient texts and modern context will be applicable to those of you from different religious traditions, and hopefully some of those parallels or differences may come out in the discussion later. So we'll be thinking about the environment as a case study to explore that. So, start with ethics. Various dictionary definitions, but they very often include this reference to rules and principles, sort of codes of behaviour, and there's a recognition these are just taken from a couple of dictionaries, of the fact that different codes of behaviour are going to emerge from different contexts. Different groups, professions, religious bodies, societies are going to have their own particular codes, and that sort of opens up to this question of which codes, where are we going to get the principles with which we make our ethical decisions. One thing to consider, which is particularly important in discussions of environmental ethics, but also anything that involves use of animals, is where do the boundaries of our moral community lie? Moral community in ethical debate is taken to refer to the moral agents. Those are agents which are able to act morally, entities which you can expect to act in a moral fashion. And also moral patients. Now, the moral patients are those entities to which you should behave in an ethical fashion, but you can't expect them to act in a particular fashion. So the moral patient may be somebody who's in a coma, or an infant, or somebody who is unable to make a rational decision and act morally for that reason. But it can also be an animal. You may feel you have an obligation to act in a certain way towards a gorilla or a chimpanzee because they are sentient, because they have high intelligence. You may feel there are things you should not do to them. You shouldn't treat them like a table or any other object, but you can't expect them to act in a particular way. So they are within, in that case, they would be within your moral community, but they would be referred to as moral patients. And so when we think about moral patients, we're thinking about extending our moral community beyond just other people who can respond in a rational and ethical fashion. And it's good in notes that the injunctions of ethics are principally injunctions to do good for people and for sentient beings more generally, perhaps. Now, that's quite a modest definition. Sentient beings, we don't want to inflict pain on animals unnecessarily. A lot of these considerations would underpin, certainly in Britain there are laws against animal experimentation. You can only do certain things under certain conditions if you want to use an animal in an experiment. Others, in considering ethical decision making with bioethics, would want to extend that further and say that actually our moral community should include the whole ecosystem. Different thinkers will extend their moral community to different limits. So just, again, just getting some of the jargon out of the way, and this is very quick, just forgive me for a very brief survey. there are different groups of ethical theories, loads and loads of different variants on each one of these, but there are some clear groups of ethical theories, and some of them are very clearly set out to provide answers to the question, what should I do? There's a particular situation, what is the right thing to do? How should I act in this situation? The first of these are natural law theories, and I've just put very quickly here a definition from Desjardins, who is actually, this is in the context of his consideration of environmental ethics. He's talking about how natural law theories tend to focus on fulfilling our natural potential, a potential implicitly in harmony with the rest of nature. It's often introduced with the idea of, there are particular conditions. If you have a plant, there are particular conditions under which it will flourish. Any particular plant needs a particular set of conditions under which it will grow and reproduce most effectively. The same can be said for animals, and the same, although obviously thinking about higher levels of existence with humans, it's not just a case of reproducing and staying alive, but there are higher levels of human existence. Ethical living should be in accordance with with the grain of the universe, as some have described it. And so you'll find in the Christian context, you will find this thinking being used by a lot of ethical practitioners, and certainly one of the examples would be in Roman Catholic theology. Natural law theorizing gets used. The most famous example is probably Pope Paul VI using natural law theory to say that artificial contraception is interfering with the natural process of procreation. Sexual intercourse is for procreation, and therefore artificial contraception is wrong. And natural law has been used to underpin that. Again, very, very briefly, I'm not doing justice to all these, the consequentialist theories of ethical decision-making, which basically are looking at what's going to happen if you do a certain action. You should do the action that is going to give the best outcome. The consequence is important. The end justifies the means. This is actually, in many cases, the policy underlying, if you've got a limited budget, for instance, for medical care, you want to try and ensure that you benefit as many patients as possible. So it's the kind of thinking that is often found in medical budgeting. If you've got a kidney, you're going to get more use out of that kidney that's been donated if you give it to somebody who's 35 than if you give it to somebody who's 55 if they're the same health. The consequences of that would be more better for that person than for this one, and so that helps you decide what you do with the kidney. It's a very, very gross example, but just to give you a general idea of the consequentialist theories and the way they work. The third group of ethical theories are known as deontological, and they are the type of theory which works on if you have an absolute rule and you stick to it. Don't worry about what the consequences are, you should follow the rule. So let justice be done though the heavens fall is the slogan that kind of epitomizes this approach, if you like. So if a consequentialist might say it's better to, if you have to have a choice, it's better to torture somebody because if you're going to get information that's going to save lives, if it's a sort of terrorist thing, you should torture someone. It's okay to torture someone if you're going to get information that will save lives. A consequentialist would say that's the best thing to do because that's going to maximise the best result. A deontologist might say, well, torture is wrong under any conditions, no matter how many lives you're going to save, that is wrong. So that kind of extreme example perhaps illustrates the difference between those two approaches. So they're based on duty, and some acts are wrong, whatever the consequences. But of course, this again raises the issue of who decides which things are wrong. Where do you get your code of behaviour from? And the fourth group of ethical theories, rather than answering the question, what do I do in this particular circumstance, answer the question, what kind of person should I be? So these are virtue-based or arithaic ethical theories, thinking more about what's going on inside the person than what you're actually doing. It's an idea of focusing on character. It might perhaps be summed up, it's not... Perhaps if you think about, if you're familiar with the story in the New Testament where Jesus says to his followers, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. That's a law, that's a rule. And Jesus then says, get people to reflect on, but when you actually, if a man looks at a woman lustfully in the wrong way, then he's committed adultery with her in his heart. There's this concentration there on what's actually happening to the person. This is not just a case of not doing the wrong thing, but what sort of person are you? And in modern contemporary Christian theology, if you've got a prime example would be Stanley Hauerwas using this kind of approach, but taking that in accordance with a lot of other thinkers in this area, reflecting on the fact that you cannot develop the right kind of character, you can't practice the virtues on your own. This is something which is done in community, and that you have to have a tradition, a story, according to which you shape your life. And so there's this sense in which in a community you find a way of nurturing the character which is going to enable you to live Christianly. That's not to say that it's only Christians who are using virtue-based ethical theories, but that's sort of just as one example of where it's happening. Now, so let's just sort of, again, just get some of the jargon out of the way that you might find if you're reading round on these subjects. When we come to think specifically about faith-based contributions to ethical debate, you will find that they will differ depending on whether the debate is internal to the faith community or external. Within a faith community, you can legitimately appeal to sacred texts, to respected authorities, whether they are contemporary authorities or whether they are historical authorities within your faith tradition. You may appeal to the tradition itself. Well, all the way through the years, this has been so within our faith, and therefore we ought to keep this tradition going. This is why we should live this particular way. Of course, when faith communities then come into the public square and wish to take part and engage in ethical debate, particularly on bioethics and the contemporary issues, it's no good for them to appeal to their sacred texts, to their traditions, if they're wanting to make a case in the public square. So you will find then that when they're in the public square, they may be employing some of these other approaches. They may say, well, the science doesn't justify this, so we should be more concerned with this and that. There may be an appeal to scientific data. There may be an appeal to this is unsafe. We may unleash a species which is going to damage the environment. If the faith community has, for religious reasons, got this approach, then they will seek to buttress that argument from other sources. Safety, obviously, is a key kind of consequentialist thing. If we do this, this will happen. There will be this dangerous outcome, so we shouldn't do it. They may also use arguments which appeal to the wider community's worldview. You'll very often find, not just from faith-based communities, but from other pressure groups in society, an appeal to very dramatic language. So certainly in Britain, in the British press, Frankenstein was employed a great deal to talk about genetically modified crops, and then more lately to talk about human modification or embryo research using animals or mixing animal and human cells. The imagery of Frankenstein, of the monster, was employed a great deal. There's this kind of public, the gut reaction, if you like, that sort of says, "Ooh, don't know if that doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound natural." And sometimes religious and other pressure groups will employ those kinds of arguments. What I'm going to focus on today, though, is intra-community debate, and focus particularly within the Christian community. But as I say, hopefully those of you from other traditions may find some parallels or some interesting differences with your own tradition. Now, within the Christian community, historically, decision-making and thinking have had a number of different inputs. There has been an acknowledgement that although humans may be flawed because of the Christian doctrine of what's commonly referred to as the fall, Adam and Eve, the first humans' disobedience from God, although human reason is not perfect, that it still has some value, that it is something that reflects something which God has put within humanity. And so there's reason is fine. You can use human reason in thinking about making ethical decisions. There's also a role for human conscience and experience. And within some strands of the Christian faith, there is a greater dependence on tradition and historically what perhaps the church fathers in the Orthodox tradition or what the great thinkers of the church in the Catholic tradition have said is relied on and drawn upon in discussing different ethical issues. But of course, for Christians, the main source has always been the sacred text, the Bible. And it's that we're going to focus on for the rest of this morning. There are different ways in which we can use the Bible, and it depends to some extent on what sort of approach you want to take towards decision making. If you're looking for something which is a nice clear-cut set of do's and don'ts, if you want to perhaps work within a deontological framework, you want to say, well, these things are wrong, I'll take my book off the shelf and look up and find out what do I do in this situation. I want a nice clear answer, this or that. And so in one way, and these sort of main ideas, I've taken some examples from Richard Haynes' book on the moral vision of the New Testament, but this particular, the first example from the Old Testament, an example of this would be the Ten Commandments. There's a set of 10 commandments. There are a whole load of other commandments in the Christian Old Testament, in the Jewish scriptures, that are commands that appear to be nice and straightforward. You do this, you don't do that. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not commit adultery. But there are a whole lot of other things like do not wear this kind of clothing with this kind of clothing. Don't put your seeds together in the same field. So there's different kinds of commandments there. Of course, the problem with contemporary bioethical debate is stem cells, transhumanism, embryo research. You're not going to find those in an ancient text. So we're not going to find some nice, clear, off the peg, as it were, ethical results. Another clear way of using the text is to look for general principles which are clearly throughout the scriptures and see if you can then take those out and apply them to a new situation. So I've taken the example of love your neighbour here. This occurs, this commandment or instruction occurs several times both in the Old Testament and in the Christian New Testament. And so therefore you can take this as a general principle. That doesn't specify how you love your neighbour, so that's something that needs to be worked out. But it's a good principle. You can say, well, is my course of action in this particular ethical dilemma I'm facing, could this be said to be in accordance with loving my neighbour or not? And of course, as I said earlier, with moral community, you then have to decide in your present context who constitutes your neighbour. Is it just humanity, or is it a wider sphere? Then you can look for examples within the sacred texts which might be applicable to the modern situation. Examples of how to live. This might be sort of more similar to thinking about the virtue-based ethics. What sorts of persons are applauded within the text? What sorts of paradigms do we have? And here, one example might be the Good Samaritan. When Jesus uses the phrase, love your neighbour, and is then asked by somebody, who is my neighbour? So this is a good deontologist. I've got to love my neighbour, so please tell me who my neighbour is, and then I know who I've got to be nice to, and who I don't have to be nice to. Instead of answering the question, Jesus very rarely answered a question straightforwardly. Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Those of you who aren't familiar with the story, very basically, the story concerns a Jewish traveller who is injured on a journey by bandits and left dying on the roadside, and two Jewish religious people have very good reasons for not stopping to help him. The person who does stop to help him is somebody who comes from a different group who mutually despise, they and the Jews mutually despise one another, but this is the person who stops and helps this Jewish person who's been injured and really looks after him very well and shows, Jesus says, who was the neighbour? Well, the neighbour was the person who helped him. And so there's this kind of breakdown, if you like, of rather than asking who is my neighbour, this is how you as a neighbour act, regardless of the identity of the person needing help. So those are the kinds of examples which you might sort of say, well, I might use this as a model in my decision making. And fourthly, we have, looking more widely at your sacred text, what sort of view of the world does it generate? Does that help you in coming to some decisions? So for instance, if, I think you looked at the first chapter of Genesis with Ernest Lucas earlier this week, yes? So if, for instance, you had the Babylonian worldview where the gods were too idle to do their own jobs, so they made humanity as slaves to get the jobs done, you'd have a somewhat less positive view of humanity, perhaps, than if you take the context of the Genesis story where God sets out to create humanity. It's the culmination of his other work of creation. It's good, there's this relationship between them. You'd end up with a different view of the world and of the rest of creation than you would if you followed the worldview of the Babylonians. And so in this context, you're looking at that kind of, what sort of principles can we see from the text? The way the text views the world, can we use those to help us in our decision making? But of course, in all of these, we have to bear in mind that there are huge differences, not just in the fact that they didn't have stem cells, they didn't have to worry about what to do in some of these situations because they didn't arrive, but culturally, the whole view of the world generally and the social background of the world is quite different. So we need to bear those differences in mind when we're trying to take things, anything, whether it's a rule or a worldview, from the text into a modern context. There's also, and I think you've probably come across this as well earlier this week with various talks, the question of how we read. Certainly with the Christian texts, the Bible is a mixture of books of different genre. We've got history, poetry, letters, we've got prophetic oracles. If you've got something like Job saying to God, you poured me out like milk and curdled me like whey in my mother's womb, to describe his growth and development, does that comment, is that something we can then bring forward to apply to thinking about how we treat human embryos? Or is it just a poetic turn of phrase? Is that something that is of value in an ethical consideration? How are we using it? We need to think carefully. There's the question of interpretation. What did the original author mean? In Philippians 2:10, talking about every knee, Paul says, will bow to Jesus. He says every knee in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. So Paul maybe had a kind of three-tier universe model in his mind. The heavens, the globe of the heavens, the dome, the earth, and under the earth. Does that mean that we can't take that statement and apply it or think about it today because we know that the universe isn't three-tier? So does that constrain its meaning? Now, I would say in that case, no, but there are other situations when it might do. And then there's the question of context. If you have a prohibition in Leviticus 19:19 on breeding across kinds of animals, does that apply to mixing genes to improve your livestock? Does that prohibition against mixing kinds apply? Is it legitimate to transfer that prohibition? And then, of course, we have to bear in mind, and this is something biblical scholars have become more aware of over the last few decades, I think, that we all come to the text with our own presuppositions. In science, we used to have this idea of the completely detached observer who wasn't sort of taking this nice objective view of what was going on. And I think in theology too, there used to be this idea that you could be this dispassionate examiner of the text. And more nowadays, there's this awareness that we all bring our mental baggage with us when we read a text. I may read a text and pick it up and read it in a different way to somebody who is reading it in Sri Lanka or South America because of our cultural difference, maybe sometimes it's gender difference, age difference, all sorts of things we bring to the texts, and then I'm sure this is true of other religious traditions as well. We bring to the text our own presuppositions and our own culture's gut reactions about what is right. We've been brought up to feel some things are right and some are not. And of course, we're reading within the context of a scientific world. So we are going to be reading differently to people who read the Bible a few hundred years ago. And I think that reminds us, as we'll see this later, that we need to be open to other people's interpretations. However carefully we're working with the text, we have to be aware that we're not going to get it right. And an openness to other people's interpretations will help us to be more flexible and less dogmatic in what we're saying. So if we just spend the last part of this morning's talk thinking about environmental ethics and trying to think how some of these things get applied. And I've just sort of subtitled this ancient text post-modern context because I wanted to underline again that I think some of these principles may well apply to other faith traditions where there is the same tensions arise between the text that was written many, many years ago and very, very different current situations. So, environmental ethics. If we come to the Christian Bible, first of all, let's think, okay, we're thinking about the environment, and that, to say environmental ethics is already a very anthropocentric way of viewing it. It's my environment, it's our environment. I prefer the term ecological, but I've stuck with this one this morning, just to kind of highlight that issue. That we're automatically viewing it as something which is centred on us. Well, what sort of rules might we find in the Christian scriptures to help us consider how to respond to the rest of creation? Well, one verse which is often drawn upon comes in the very first chapter of Genesis, towards the close of the creation account, where God tells humanity to subdue the earth and have dominion over the living creatures. Now, this might be, you can come to this and take it and think, okay, fine, so subdue, have dominion. That has clear connotations of hierarchy. Humanity's in charge, okay? And it's a fairly kind of macho kind of in charge. It's not just minding. It's subdue. It's fairly strong language. And in fact, in Hebrew, the terms are quite strong. They're used sometimes elsewhere in militaristic warfare settings. So that, that seems to be a kind of the pioneer spirit, taming the wilderness, making a garden. But what do those terms mean? Well, others might interpret them differently and think, actually, This is before Adam and Eve have disobeyed God. God is addressing humanity in an ideal humanity, and in that context, dominion could be taken to be similar to God's dominion. God's dominion, God's rule, as we see it through the Hebrew scriptures, is one of caring for his creation, sustaining, looking after, shepherding, the pictures of God as a shepherd with his people, providing food for the animals, all these kind of imageries throughout the Hebrew scriptures. So maybe God's telling humanity to take care of his creation, and it isn't dominion in a kind of a ruling dominion, but in a caring, supporting dominion. So we have some differences of opinion on interpretation there. Then there are a few other clear commands. People should have a rest every 7 days, God tells his people, and your animals, your domestic animals, should also rest every 7 days, and every 7 years you give the land a rest. So there's this sense in which all of creation is included in God's provisions of laws for rest for humanity to some extent. So these can be drawn from, these are nice clear instructions. There is some concern, and there's concern specifically for animal welfare. Don't muzzle your ox while it's treading the grain. This is the wrong way to treat an animal. Well, this is nice. This is all looking nice and green and animal welfare-y. But when we come to the New Testament, and Paul in 1 Corinthians refers to the don't muzzle an ox, Paul says, wasn't this written for us? Didn't God have us in mind? And he's using it as support for his argument that people who spread the gospel should be supported in their doing of that. Is God concerned about oxen, says Paul, in a tone within the Greek which might be taken to imply the answer is no. And there aren't any clear commandments or phrases or addressing the care of creation specifically within the New Testament, it may be argued. So, okay, that's our look at rules. Let's go on to look at principles. Going back again to Ms. Lucas's talk earlier this week, the world, during the creation story, the world is described in several places as good. And I've put here no dualism. I mean here no dualism between a kind of good spiritual and a bad material. Reminding us yesterday of Bill's talk, he mentioned the Gnostic heresy, this sense in which matter is secondary and spirit is good, but spirit is trapped inside this kind of unpleasant sub-secondary material world. There isn't that idea in the creation story. There is no hint of that dualism. Matter is good, the world is good, creation is good, the land, the plants, the animals, they are all proclaimed to be good. So that could be a principle that we might draw from the Christian scriptures. Others, however, would point out that after Adam and Eve's disobedience towards God, God says to the land, it's cursed, and he tells Adam it will only produce thorns and thistles for him. And some have taken that to mean that, therefore, creation as a whole is fallen. It's not just Adam and Eve that are marred, are broken effectively, are no longer as they should be in God's sight, but the whole of creation is similarly fallen. Others would say, okay, well, another principle is not only is creation good, but when we come to the covenant with Noah and his family, when they're in the ark, they've been saved through the flood, they come out of the ark, God makes a new covenant with them. And he says, I won't flood the earth again, I'll put my rainbow in the heavens as a reminder. But his covenant is not just with Noah and his family, but with all living things. So this is another principle. God has not just said everything is good, but he makes this covenant with everything. But of course, those who are looking for kind of green, eco-friendly strands within the Bible struggle a bit with the flood. It doesn't seem particularly eco-friendly. And not only that, but in the same chapter as God is making this covenant with all living creatures, he's giving Noah and his family permission to kill and eat the animals, as long as they don't eat the blood. Adam and Eve had been given vegetables to eat, vegetables and fruit, had been said, that's all for you. But Noah and his family are told they can kill and eat animals. So there's this kind of sense in which, at the same time as having this covenant, they're also this, again, maybe this kind of hierarchy coming in to the language. Okay, well, let's look for paradigms. Now, in Christian theology, the first place to look for an example of how to live is the life of Christ. Christ is the exemplar. And so many eco-theologians look to the New Testament and they talk about Jesus. The stories of Jesus are often set in the countryside or in small towns. You don't find the gospel stories set in Sepphoris or any of the other larger Roman cities. It's a story. Jesus, often they sort of think of Jesus as this kind of nice rural lad, talks about seeds and sunsets and crops and animals. Jesus uses the terminology of the natural world. He talks about God knowing when a bird falls. He talks about if God looks after the birds and flowers and clothes them, how much more will he look after you? You, he says, are of much more value than the birds. So he's using God's care for other life forms as an example, so that's undoubtedly there. But of course, you have also got this, again, this value. Humans have much more value. And also, others point out that maybe when Jesus sends a group of demons into a herd of pigs and the pigs drown, they run into the sea and drown, or Jesus comes up and, as an illustration, goes over to this fig tree, looks for fruit, can't see it, and curses the fig tree, which promptly curls up and dies. It isn't all kind of cosy, green, eco-Jesus. And I know I'm being a little flippant here, but you can see that the picture can be painted of Jesus as being very in touch with nature, and has been in some books. But there are other sides to the story, and there's this clear indication Jesus in a boat with his disciples, and there's a storm blows up, and Jesus subdues the storm. So again, there's this clear. Obviously, this is an indication. It's taken in the Gospels, an indication of Jesus' identity and power and authority over creation. But there's this sense in which it's not all kind of eco-friendly, perhaps. Looking more widely at the world view, we've already said creation is good. There is this sense in the Bible, very clear teaching that everything comes from God. It is all created by God. And so we can say, well, this is all God's work. Not only do you get passages where people say how they praise God, they look to the heavens and they feel drawn to praise God, but there's also this language of nature praising God, the heavens proclaiming God's glory. This sense of people sensing God in creation, or being aware of God through creation. And you get passages like this in the Old Testament. You also get this coming through in New Testament, that people should have been aware of God, Paul says, because they can see the creation. So they should be aware of the fact that there's a creator. And again, there's this sense, there isn't this sense of Gnostic kind of release of nice, healthy spirit from nasty material matter. When the Bible talks about the end, when God is going to make all things right and just and wipe away every tear, it's not talking about God's people being disembodied spirits or being all kind of just swallowed up into God and losing their identity. Paul talks very practically of new bodies, of spiritual bodies, but bodies nevertheless. It's an embodied resurrection. And the Bible talks about a new heavens and earth. It's not, as I share Tom, I wince having read Tom Wright on this. I wince every time I hear somebody talk about Christians going to heaven. Because as Tom Wright is constantly reminding us, it's a new heavens and earth. It's not kind of upwards, but there's this whole new creation to look forward to. And so maybe we should be more positive about the present creation because it's God's work, not sort of view it as something that we're not concerned with. But there is this fact that it's a new earth and the old one is passing away. So should we be concerned with the old earth? Should we be concerned about species diversity or extinction? Does it matter if God's going to make a new one? And there's currently in the literature a debate as to whether a new earth should be interpreted to mean brand new off the shelf or renewed. Are the scriptures talking about this earth being renewed and made whole and good again, or is it talking about this one being done away with and replaced by a new one? And does that make a difference? Does that make a difference to how we should respond to the current earth and how we treat it? Others point out that, well, all this business about nature praising God is just anthropomorphic. It's just people putting human language onto things. It isn't, nature isn't really praising God. It's just poetic language, some would argue. And isn't the whole biblical witness, as in most religious texts, human-centered? It's about the creation of humans. It's about human failing. It's about God saving humans. It's about the resurrection of humans. And creation, nice though it is, good though it is, in some people's view, a backdrop. It's just a setting. It's just a stage for human redemption. And therefore, although we shouldn't go out and kick the dog, we don't need to be overly concerned about environmental damage as long as it's just seen as a backdrop to the salvation of humanity. So there are different approaches to handling this data, different viewpoints on the biblical data, if you like. I just want to outline these and then hopefully we can have some discussion on this. One approach is the first two approaches are to come to this data and this debate over the interpretation and what it means, and to say, well, I'm going to focus on this stuff. I take priority. I'm going to take this lot as having priority over that. So the first approach might be, and these are all slightly caricatures because obviously everybody has a range of different approaches, but hopefully these will illustrate the examples. One approach is to say, well, I'm going to take the very clear, the Bible is about humanity and the salvation of humanity. Humans are given dominion over the earth. And this is kind of, I think, seeing then science as the process of recovering dominion over the earth. This is a quote from Francis Bacon. I am come in very truth, leading to you nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave. This is the kind of the project to recapture dominion over the earth, to tame the wilderness, to make the earth productive. The Bible is about the salvation of human beings, and this is part of the project of that is taming the wilderness. And you find this kind of approach to the earth, to the environment, in some strands, certainly of some American, not all, but some American evangelical strands of teaching. This very kind of clear focus on humanity as the centre stage. And a second approach, and perhaps on that kind of focusing on those hierarchical passages. The second approach is taking that alternative reading of subdue and have dominion as saying, well, humanity is actually being given responsibility for the earth. And that's where from this emerges the idea of the stewardship of creation. It doesn't actually say anywhere in the text, you should be stewards, humanity should be stewards of creation. But that's an inference which is made from the have dominion, but read in conjunction with the next chapter of Genesis, where Adam is told to till and serve the earth. And so there's that caring can be read, the tilling and serving, looking after the land, can be taken to kind of interpret the having dominion. And from that emerges the idea of stewardship, that humanity are stewards of the earth and therefore are responsible for looking after it. And therefore you tend to read the more positive strands within the biblical tradition of care, the Sabbath rest, looking after, caring for the animals, having this sense of responsibility for the earth. Some would go further than this and would read texts in the Bible which talk about Paul talking about creation, waiting for the revelation of the sons of God to enter into the freedom of the glory of the sons of God. And elsewhere in the letter to the Colossians, the idea of God reconciling all things. And so some would take these texts to say that not only are humans given stewardship and should be caring for the earth, but actually the whole of creation is going to get caught up in the salvation event. That God is not just redeeming human beings, but is going to redeem the whole of creation. Some would read that as meaning there will be some of every species God has ever made in the new earth. Be interesting if there's some dinosaurs. In a redeemed kind of version of them somehow. And some people from Charles Wesley onwards have argued that actually the Bible teaches that the scope of Christ's work on the cross and his resurrection means that every living creature will be resurrected, not just humans. So there's a whole kind of spectrum here of how much you can see the whole of creation caught up in God's purposes. So they're kind of focusing on different strands or different interpretations of the material within the Bible. A third approach, rather than trying to find the rules and the principles, the specific commandments, is looking more at these general principles within the Bible. I mentioned love of neighbour earlier. Various writers in this area have focused on things like love of neighbour, community, wisdom, incarnation, to think about how to treat the natural world. For instance, love of neighbour. Well, if we extend love of neighbour and that sacrificial love of neighbour that is called for in the Christian scriptures, to beyond the human community, well, that would call for a high degree of environmental care. We're caring for the whole of the ecosystem. If we're thinking about viewing ourselves in community with other living creatures and not just with one another, other humans, those kind of mutual responsibility, the ideas, the commandments for the upbuilding of the Israelite community in the Old Testament, some of those could be taken further. Some would argue that the incarnation, and it was interesting, we were talking a bit about this yesterday, Christians have no difficulty in seeing Jesus incarnated as a human male is still relevant for human females. Some would argue, well, Jesus was incarnated as a living creature. So yes, Jesus brought, something special in the incarnation in being a human being, but in fact, God is present in the whole of creation. And some of the kind of sacramental theology focusing on meeting God in the bread and wine, seeing God in creation, is using those kinds of thoughts to generate a wider care for the non-human elements of creation. Sorry, we're a little late starting. Others take a different approach and come with an outside agenda to the texts. Now, this approach doesn't sit very well with all Christians, but some find this productive. They say, well, we're in a world with an environmental crisis. These are a set of eco-justice principles, if you like, in the same way others may have brought a set of feminist principles, and weigh the text, weigh the Bible, and we'll bring these set of principles about treating other species equally and giving care to them. Pardon me. And we'll bring these principles and we'll say, well, okay, some of the bits of the Bible are earth-friendly, and so we can use those, and the bits that aren't earth-friendly, like killing the pigs by sending the demons into them and then drowning, well, those passages are not helpful, so we'll simply just not consider them. We'll just weigh up the Bible, we'll take these bits, keep the bits we want, and we'll reject the other ones. And there's hermeneutics of suspicion is the kind of theological jargon, simplified way of viewing this. So that's another approach. These are all different approaches that you will find within the Christian church's traditions. So what I think these all illustrate, very different approaches coming to very different conclusions, is that we all use these lenses, and I spoke earlier about bringing our presuppositions to the text. This illustrates that we bring our lenses not just in terms of our cultural and scientific knowledge and the sort of stuff that we've grown up with and we take for granted, but we come to the text and we're looking for something. If we're environmentally friendly people, we want to find something there to support greater environmental care, we are going to tend to see those kinds of things in the text more easily. And it just warns us to be careful when we're using sacred scriptures, whether it's in the Christian tradition or somewhere else, to not just come looking for what we want to see and kind of read it through a green lens, if you like. Stewardship is a lens. You can say there's some biblical basis for it, but then nevertheless, if you're then using that to read the rest of the text, you are viewing it in a particular way. And this, I don't think this is just when you read it your way and I'll read it my way. There's this sense, we talked about critical realism last night, Dennis mentioned it. I feel where you've got the same kind of thing with the biblical text. We agree there is truth there, and we are hopefully humble enough to know that although we're seeking it and approaching it and investigating it, we aren't going to necessarily be able to say we've got it sorted, we've got it all done and dusted, we know it exactly. We are approaching an understanding of the truth, but that leaves a room for dialogue with others who differ from us in our interpretation. And this, you'll find this in, for instance, debates on human embryology. I know that I held different views on the status of the early human embryo to other Christians. We're reading the scriptures differently, we're understanding them differently, but we can still have a mutual respect for each other's views. And what I've put down here as approach 5 is something which we've been trying to explore in the work I did do at Exeter up until a year or so ago, is trying to say, reminding Christians that we can't just read ethics from modern context straight off the pages of an ancient text. There are not going to be very many situations where these very new situations can be addressed by an off-the-peg answer. We need to be very careful of saying, this is what the Bible says. The famous story of having a Bible on the table and somebody saying, well, I believe what the Bible says, and somebody's going, can't hear anything. Every time you read it, you are interpreting it. The very translation is an interpretation. So we need some humility in when we're sort of coming with this is what it says, a recognition that this is what we are understanding it to say, and an openness to listening to others. And an awareness that we're bringing this lens, just an awareness that we are reading it from a very particular position and background. These are just some books which some emerging from our project that are out addressing these subjects. This is one of the Earth Bible books, reading from the perspective of Earth, which is taking very much that approach I said, where you bring an external set of criteria, eco-justice principles in their case, they refer to them, and evaluate different texts against that set of eco-justice principles. That's a collection of essays by different people, which I brought a couple of copies with me, looking at different bits of the Bible and at different Christian theologians through the ages, and different perspectives on how we can use their resources to think about ecology. And that's a kind of a more, the previous one is more aimed at theology students probably. This one's more aimed towards the general reader. That should have been out, isn't out yet, but I've got some flyers for that on the bookshelf in case anybody wants to take the details, by a colleague of mine at Exeter. So just, I won't go through the last few slides because the notes are on your handouts. It's just some quotations about reminding us that we need to read humbly. More sophisticated exegesis, that's the kind of interpretation looking at the text, is not enough. People who think that is enough are those who think they can fly if they flap their arms hard enough. We need to take not just looking at the text, but the context, our wider society. These are just some quotations from Richard Hayes and Stephen Barton. Reading it in community, I feel, is important, and reading it in our generation. And just finishing with Stephen Barton's, the true meaning of the text is never static. It resides in the transcendent living word of God, to whom the words of the text bear frail witness. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions.
Sorry, I should just say the last slide isn't on your handout. I got the details too late to put it on. It's another very good generally accessible text by Richard Buck on looking at similar kind of materials.
Yes, thank you.
Apologies for leaving that
Indeed.
on.
At the back.
So, at least I've met very few people who would disagree with the agricultural practices in artificial selection we've done for thousands of years being ethical. But I've also met very few people who think we should be completely unconstrained, and most people fall somewhere in between, but all over the whole spectrum. But kind of the nature of legislature is we have to be able to draw some lines somewhere, otherwise we will be unconstrained. How can we work towards getting people who fall all over the spectrum to agree, at least somewhere, to actually create a law that puts some limits?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question when you're thinking about legislature, because while when you're talking together and discussing, you can live with a spectrum of views. When it comes to actually getting something down on paper as a law, then you have to draw the line somewhere, as you say. I think generally and I'm not a legislator, but I imagine when people are drawing up laws, there is a sense in which you're having to not only take on board a spectrum of different views, but you are, in many cases, I think, working with the principle of caution. And so you tend, I hope our lawmakers tend to think where there's risk. I mean, in many cases, legislators are coming from the consequentialist basis, aren't they? They're looking at risk and benefits. The benefits to society of doing this in terms of better crops, better food supplies, or dare I say it, cheaper food supplies, against the risk of mass starvation or some diseases emerging in the population. And so I think the precautionary principle should be applied when it comes to legislating for these things, because safety tends to be the ultimate kind of bar, if you like, when it comes to legalising things. I think with the ethical debate, it's slightly different, because we're trying to work out if it's right and not just whether it's safe or whether it's going to generate foods for people. And so I think, as I said that earlier, that's where that tension is. I think when religious communities are having a discussion amongst themselves, it's one thing. But when they're arguing in the public square, they are having to employ other arguments. And therefore, when it comes to legislation, I think we tend to get into that consequentialist safety net. I'm not sure that answers your question. So I think it's difficult to go from the religious setting, if you like, into a legal, in the public square. You tend to have very different arguments.
Yes.
You just repeated something which I thought you'd said earlier, which I feel uncomfortable about. That's the idea that we don't bring our Christian values into the public square. We look for other. I agree that we have to find wider issues, but as those of us who are Christians or from other communities, we surely have a right to bring our perspectives to the debate. as much as others.
Absolutely, yes.
So
yeah.
how do you get the balance there?
Yeah, I suppose what I was trying to say, perhaps not very well, is that not that we don't come into the public square and say we think this because, but if we're seeking to be persuasive to those who don't have that context, then it's no good us saying, well, we think this is wrong because it says in Leviticus or it says in 1 Corinthians. We can say, look, we are a significant proportion of the population and we feel this is wrong, morally wrong. But then we are, I think most religious campaign groups are seeking to find common grounds with others outside, and so therefore perhaps there's an equal amount of energy that goes into that. Absolutely, I'd agree with you. It's right to say this is why we think this is wrong, but we can't then expect that to be persuasive to people from outside our tradition. And I think, of course, this is something which has become more the case as our society becomes more and more pluralist. You've got a greater number of different voices, and that changes the playing field, if you like.
That's interesting. It seems to me, if I might have a question, that with these broad principles you gave at the beginning, something like virtue ethics, that's great, what kind of person will that be, but it's hard to see how that feeds in to some kind of recommendation for what the law ought to be on some issue. Whereas, say, natural law ethics, with broader principles about what makes for human flourishing, might well find more common ground.
Yes, you're right, because there's always been that understanding in natural law that there's a certain amount of that is written on everybody's hearts, if you like, and that sense that you can appeal to something which is more widely felt and approved of in the wider society. So yes, I mean, maybe there's a grounds for thinking of using those principles more in public square, even if, as you say, you're using a kind of virtue pattern within the community. Yes, I think that there is some value in that. I'm not sure how. I mean, the thing is, with a lot of secular argumentation, there's been this assumption that all rational beings will agree with this, and this. But actually, a lot of it has arisen within a Western European setting, and they've just kind of tried to jettison the faith basis and keep the principles, and then assume that everybody all around the globe thinks the same. And then, of course, when you go and come up against very different cultures, you find that maybe some of the things you assumed are true of everybody at all times, in all places, are not as applicable as you thought they were. So there might be more limits again, but that would be interesting to explore.
Yeah,
and some of that, of course, can come out in interfaith dialogue, which is why I think that particularly is important when we're facing some of these issues. And again, although I only spoke of the text I'm familiar with this morning, but I'm wondering whether within other religious communities it would be good to find those common ground, because if you've got it between the faiths, then the likelihood is it has got this broader appeal across societies. And of course nowadays, more and more, law is not just something which is our society. More and more of the laws are having wider. We're looking for European-wide laws. We're looking for international laws. It's no good banning something in one country if people can just go and do it somewhere else. So you're having to go to a much wider audience now in making these appeals.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the question there. Yeah.
This was very good introduction. Sort of following on what Robbie said, it seems that there is a lot of potential here for dialogue between religious communities and scientific communities that are not religious. And I wonder if, in your own experience, you've seen particular theological arguments that do have traction in the scientific community, because it seems, at least in the U.S., scientists are really looking for good reasons to communicate to the general public that they ought to be concerned about the environment. And then sort of on the other side, are there things that are holding religious communities back, or areas where you see misunderstanding?
Do you mean particularly with reference to environmental ethics? I think I think there's a tension, because some strands. There's such a variety of opinion within the Christian faiths, not so much across the denominations, but even within, for instance, within the American evangelical framework. One of my friends in Canada has just completed a study of looking at different evangelical responses towards the environment, and a huge spectrum just there, ranging from that, tame the wilderness, sort of pioneer spirit stuff with Calvin Beisner's writing, right across to something which we in Britain would recognise much more with sort of stewardship paradigm. And I don't know whether it hangs on the importance of humanity or not. It's important to try and understand whether people are reading the text very differently because some people are concerned that you're diluting the gospel if you start to focus on non-humans. I think that's a real concern within some constituencies of the Christian tradition, that if you start talking about the whole of creation, and possibly, as I said, even with some folks taking it further and saying the whole of creation is caught up in the redemption, then some people feel that there is a danger in losing the focus. And I think perhaps reassuring them, that constituency, that the others are not losing the focus might help get them on board. I mean, one commentator, and we picked this up on one of the websites, and I have got a quotation somewhere, I can't remember where it is. It's something like a Christian who goes off to help work with the environment is like a brain surgeon who stops in the middle of an operation to go and unblock the toilet. That there are more important things to do. You've got to go and evangelise and convert everybody, never mind unblocking the toilet. That's not what you're called to do. It might be a worthwhile task. This guy wasn't saying it's not, the planet should be left to go to rack and ruin, but that's not what your primary focus should be. And I think there's a fear expressed there that the church is going to lose its way, is going to lose its focus. And so maybe we need to kind of reassure that particular element, that there isn't a sort of dilution of that. Maybe that's the debate that needs to be had, rather than should we be caring for the earth, because nobody's sort of saying, let it go hang. Well, not very many. Most people acknowledge at least some responsibility, even if it's a taming it, even if it's a let's go out and turn it into a park. They're acknowledging some responsibility, but that does seem to be stemming partly from that concern that it's getting too fluffy, too soft, and losing its focus. So I think that's probably where it stems from. Whether we can do that or not, I don't know.
Yes.
This might be slightly provocative, and I hope I'm expressing it properly. But just looking at the environmental issues, is it possible to scale it back and say these aren't really environmental issues, these are human issues? In other words, to me, if you were more considerate of love your neighbor, then you wouldn't have to start worrying about animals and so on. I think a lot of the decisions that are made that impact the environment, if you first thought love your neighbor, you wouldn't even end up with environmental issues.
Yeah. I think you have hit the nail on the head. Very much so. It's absolutely true. If you just take humans as important, and everybody took seriously the love your neighbour, and your moral community extends to the whole globe and not just the people next door, then we should all be living in such an environmentally friendly way in order to prevent suffering through flooding or whatever around the globe, that, as you say, the ecosystem would take care of itself. But maybe human savings being what they are, some of this needs re-envisioning. People need to see. And of course, that's some of the debate on the climate change, whether it's real or not. People are going in there. If you take the climate change data seriously, that our energy use in the developed world is wrecking the climate for people in the developing world, then that's completely enough motivation to look after the environment. I agree with you, absolutely. But some of it, obviously some of us are not doing it. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%.
But then maybe shouldn't we frame the debate a little bit differently? Because to me, when you get into the eco part,
Yeah.
as you showed us very eloquently, I think there's much less argument on love your neighbor than there would be on interacting with the environment.
Yeah, and maybe that, as long as that doesn't get me into an argument on whether climate change is real or not. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And yes, I think that probably is one very clear way of doing it. That would, without losing the focus, that to persuade that constituency that are worried about that, that would be a very good way of doing it. If we can persuade them that there is a real issue and that they need to take that on board. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Paul, I think, first. The logical conclusion of what you just said is that the number of humans on the planet is increasing. It's increasing rapidly at the moment, and it is the impact of humans on that is causing harm. You're going to be encouraging people to, well, coming up with more and more brutal forms of population control, and ultimately the suicide of the entire species, at which point the environment will settle down and get on very well without us. Where's the enough is enough point? Where's the reasonable point?
In terms of the sustainable world population?
Yes.
Well, I'm not a population scientist, I don't know what the thing is, of course, what's always said in response to the issue of population is that it's not so much the number that we have now, it's the amount that we in the West are using. And if we lived in a far simpler fashion, there would be a lot more to go around. So that's one answer. Another answer I heard, I can't remember the gentleman's name, he came and spoke at one of the conferences you had here.
Right.
A doctor from London, and he was talking about the best thing the people in the West can do for the environment is cut their family size.
Just Gillibo.
Thank you, Gillibo. Because it's humans in the developed West that are using up the resources, and so actually cutting your family size in the West will have much more impact than cutting the family size in the parts of the world where the population is growing, because 10 of them would only use a fraction of the resources one person would in this part of the world.
There's pressure in the BRIC countries and the third world to
But it's also the case that where infant mortality rates drop, where education of women increases, the population size does come under, the increase in population drops. So there's a sense in which a lot of the population rise is driven by the bad conditions that people are living in.
ultimately, is there going to be too many people?
Ultimately, there's going to be a need to keep a steady state. Yes, I guess there will be. Yes, but what that steady state would be, what the maximum carrying capacity, if we all lived more modestly, is, I'm afraid I can't tell you. It's not my field of expertise. I don't know if anybody here works in population. Anybody got any data?
No.
Sorry, I can't. That's outside my area. So
Do
yeah.
you have something on that, John? Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to, two things. World population has doubled in my lifetime. It's a statistic to grab hold of, and of course, enormous impact. The other thing, you leave climate change aside and ignore it, there's still enormous problem of, say, pollution. We need to go from SK aside. It's a pollution of oils happening in places like Nigeria and so on. You're impacting on to get energy, you're impacting other people's environments, and you are damaging them quite considerably. And as population goes up, of course, you do come to the problem of food supply and the need to provide cheap food, because not everybody has a nice middle class standard of living, even in this country.
Absolutely.
And there are problems there. So there are wider problems, I think. Looking at the environment, we are responsible for it.
So are you saying you think that those other issues, setting aside climate change, would be sufficient to use an ethic of love your neighbour to promote enough change in lifestyle?
I think, what I'm saying, I'm a climatologist, if you don't believe in climate change, yes.
Yeah. There are enough other issues.
There are enough other issues, yes.
To use that love your neighbour, that sort of, if you like, an anthropocentric motive for environmental care. There's sufficient cause
Yes.
now. Yes. Yeah, you're probably right. Whether we can persuade people of that is another matter.
Thank you.
it seemed to me for a long time that environmental issues and issues of global justice are inextricably linked with the overuse of world's resources in the very developed countries and the lack of access to those resources in the undeveloped countries. And this kind of ties in with what the last two questioners have said. And that's always been my approach, if you like. One of my approaches to environmental ethics, not just because it's God's and therefore we should look after it, but actually he wants us to care for all the inhabitants of the planet.
Yes.
And I'm focusing here mainly on the human inhabitants, because Christ died for them all.
Yes. So get sort of that kind of love your neighbour effectively as well.
It overrides the whole thing.
Yeah.
Maybe one last one. Dennis?
Well, I just want to come back to the subject of GM crops for a moment and the huge variety of ways in which people respond in different parts of the world. So I think it's quite intriguing why that might be, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts. For example, in the past 12 years, 150 different GM crops or food-producing plants have been approved in different parts of the world, right across the board, some for development and so forth. The European community, the number has been 2.
I know, yes.
Okay, so what's, and the United States is so much more open. So USA has plenty of food, and so it's not just simply a question of development and scientific expertise or so forth. Because when you compare the USA and Europe, you see two totally different worlds in their attitudes towards GM foods. I just thought we may not be able to answer it all now, but I just wanted to float the query, and maybe you had some thoughts on that, or we can come back to it later if you like.
As to why there's a difference between across the globe and the acceptance of GM.
Well, let's take Europe as the example. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the classic example of attitudes of just legislation, public attitudes, are totally pretty anti-GM foods, hence only 2 have been approved. Actually, the European Union is just changing its attitude, but
yes,
that's in process. But if we just take the history until now, it's been a very negative general view, isn't it?
The process of plant GM was invented in Europe.
Yeah. So you get the.
I wonder whether it's an old world, new world thinking. I think probably in the developing world there would be sufficient kind of economic pressures and feeding. If you could see you've got a good yield, or it's got a vitamin C supplement built in genetically or something like that, I can see, as you say, why the developing world would be different. Between America and Europe, I mean, I would guess that there's sometimes a way of thinking differently between the old world and the new world, it seems to me. The States, from their kind of legacy of being the pioneers, tend to, I mean, there's this sort of legendary, isn't it, there's a number of British inventions that get developed elsewhere. I think sometimes there's more a spirit of go out and do it and try it, sometimes on that side of the Atlantic than there is on this side. I don't know whether it's got any basis in ethical reflection, or whether it's just that we're more conservative and small c on this side of the Atlantic, but I mean, that would just be a guess.
Well, thank you. I think we just have to draw to a close. That's gone 10:30, and there will be the box, of course, for questions for the panel. So in the meantime, thank you very, very much.